Hey, seniors, it's Mr. Brewer here. So wanted to give you just a few words of encouragement to try to hang in there. I know the situation is not ideal, and it's something that, in all honesty, I feel what you guys, I sense what you guys are feeling about what's going on. And I'm sorry that things are the way that they are, but we're going to try to make the best of the circumstances that we have to try to finish the job throughout the year. So I'll try to save getting too sentimental with you till later in the year because I think that's probably the appropriate thing to do. So I wanted to bring you a real quick lesson today that'll guide you to doing some independent work afterwards. Let me see if I can't reduce my face here, if I can figure that out here. I don't need to see my big old ugly mug the whole time here that we're speaking. So I want to share something on the screen with you and see if we can make that work. There we go. I think that's a little better. So what I'd like to take a look at with you today, something that's kind of timely in the world, kind of relates to human behavior and how human behavior creates what we would call hazards, specifically hazards that relate to biological hazards. So just want to give you some introductory material on this today. So we'll get rid of my ugly mug so we can get right down to business here. There we go, that's better. So in terms of hazards in the environment, well, one thing that people can do is, or cannot do, is that would be treat their wastewater and their waste, human excrement or urine, sometimes making its way right into our rivers, lakes, or streams, water supplies that we drink from. And obviously that can create disease, and that's a challenge, especially in third world nations or countries that are still developing that don't have the infrastructure that a more developed nation would. A second thing that can have an impact on ideas that relate to biological hazards would be related to the use of pesticides. As we use more and more pesticides, organisms become more resistant to those pesticides, and we end up creating sort of like organisms that are superorganisms, where they're a little more difficult to kill using any kind of chemical agent like a pesticide. And that can create some challenges for us. Another thing might be the overuse of antibiotics. Antibiotics can do something very similar to what pesticides do. The overuse of them can create disease-causing organisms or pathogens that become more and more resistant to the use of those or the commonly used antibiotics. And obviously that creates challenges. Sometimes we also feed those antibiotics to things like livestock, sheep, cattle, so on and so forth, goats, things that we raise for food source. And that all of these things can have a direct impact in terms of toxicity on organisms. And finally, we know that there are these things that we call pathogens, and pathogens are often thought of as being microorganisms, things like bacteria or viruses, and the presence of those bacteria and viruses can have a lot to do with what we do with our wastewater, how we treat or do not treat for pests that are present, the use of antibiotics in the world. So there's kind of a woven pattern that there's relatedness between a lot of these topics. So specifically, human actions have caused an impact on the way things happen in terms of relationships to hazards in the environment. So here it says something about the widespread use of pesticides. Over time, that's allowed organisms to evolve and become more resistant to the effect of those pesticides. And sometimes that even has an impact later on down the road where the pesticides kill off critical organisms like bees. Bees typically pollinate crops, and without enough bee population around, a crop production could actually be impacted pretty significantly because of lack of pollination. Our second idea on here are frequent use of antibiotics that can create these things that we call super bugs sometimes, and a superbug is a pathogen, an organism that's become more resistant to the typical antibiotics that we use to fight them off. So more frequent use of antibiotics creates more resistant pathogens. We have the same sort of thing that happens when we raise livestock. We feed those livestock antibiotic, and that allows the buildup of more resistant strains of bacteria to build up in those organisms, and that um, creates some challenges, some problems as humans consume those organisms. Our second slide has a series of hazards that human action also have an impact upon. One be improper sewage or waste disposal. Um, what that's done is that's contaminated the local water supply in many places around the world, especially our developing nations, and that allows breeding grounds for pathogens, disease-causing organisms to live in, our water supplies. One thing that can also happen is that improper sewage disposal can contaminate the soil. As that sewage trickles down onto the soil, that soil can over time dry out and blow away, or it can be eroded, and that can cause the spread of disease through contact with soil, not necessarily just the water itself. And finally, the raising of livestock in very close quarters. Obviously, when organisms are very close to one another, as one organism contracts a disease, that can be easily spread to another organism in very close proximity. So this was just an introduction to some of the human actions. What we're going to take a look at soon are some of the terminology or some of the key terms that relate to the spread of biological hazards. And specifically, one of the topics will become infectious disease. But for now, our focus was on human impact and how actions of people can have an impact on hazards in the environment. So I hope you found the information in today's lesson useful. And until the next time, we'll be signing off. Talk to you soon.